Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Steve Cannane. Coming up, Julia Gillard visits the army in Afghanistan. But is she right on troop numbers? Do countries get value for money out of hosting the Soccer World Cup? And later in the show, we'll find out what a price on carbon could cost your household. Our guest tonight, Deputy Editor of The Punch, Tory Maguire, Tim Soutphommasane, Research Fellow at Monash University, and Foreign Affairs commentator and regular contributor to The Drum, Thom Woodroofe. Well, Julia Gillard donned a Defence Force cap on the weekend to make a surprise visit to the Australian troops in Afghanistan. Ms Gillard says she welcomes the upcoming parliamentary debate on the war as an opportunity to build public support. But the Prime Minister has dismissed calls from the opposition that more troops and equipment are needed in Afghanistan.
The fact that we have deployed the right number of people with the right equipment to equip the mission was confirmed to me by the Chief of the Defence Force. It was also confirmed to me by commanders on the ground like General Jim Crichton, like General Cantwell, that we have the appropriate force size for our mission.
Tory, this follows the comment from last week from the coalition saying that we need 360 more troops over Afghanistan. Is this the first sign that there are different opinions on Afghanistan?
Oh, look, I think both sides are always going to say that they support the mission there, and they're also both saying that they agree on what the mission is, which is just to train the Afghan National Army in Uruzgan. The problem that I think both of them are going to run into sometime soon, and possibly during the parliamentary debate, is whether or not that is, in fact, all that we're trying to achieve. And that's where things are going to get very tricky for them, because I think any discussion between Julia Gillard and Tony Abbott about troop numbers just looks really dumb, because they're not the military commanders. Julia Gillard says we don't need any more troops based on what the military commanders in Afghanistan are telling her. And at the moment, you kind of have to believe them. And Tony Abbott doesn't really have the expertise to be saying that those blokes are wrong. But I think one of the problems for both of them is that everyone in Australia recognises that perhaps the mission is more complicated and more ambitious than they're letting on. And at some point, they're going to have to tell us that and come clean about it. And if it is much more ambitious, then perhaps we are going to have to increase our commitment.
Tim, is there more to our mission than training Afghan troops?
Well, there's been a shifting rationale in the NATO allied forces engagement in Afghanistan over the past 9 or so years. First, it was about fighting international terrorism. That morphed into an exercise of nation building. Now, if we are talking about nation building, we're talking about a very, very long and protracted project here. And if that is what the engagement is about, then we have to talk, need to have a debate, I think, about whether it's in fact right to commit troops to such a project. Because at the moment, Hamid Karzai's administration is being outgoverned in many provinces, and there are many provinces of Afghanistan that are simply ungovernable as well.
Tom, is that all the mission's about, is training those troops? Because Julia Gillard says that it'll take 2 to 4 years, and for Tim saying, you know, they're talking about nation building, it doesn't seem like it's going to take 2 or 4 years. It could take much longer than that.
It's definitely much wider than that. And I think the issue of the terrorist warnings overnight, or the travel warnings for Europe, which also includes sort of extra drone flights in the northern parts of Pakistan, show that this region is the front line still in the fight against terrorism, as well as the nation-building projects that need to take place and are taking place at the moment.
Now, Tom, Tony Abbott could have gone with Julia Gillard if he chose to, but he chose not to. What was in that, do you think?
Oh, I think politically it probably points to the fact that this debate will open up a little bit in the next few months. I think that if he had gone, he would have sent, whilst quite a strong level of bipartisanship, it would have been seen to be agreeing with the endorsements that Gillard would have then come out with and said, which she has now done once she arrived in Brussels. It was strange, I must admit. They are both on their way to Europe and both have now arrived there. But he will probably visit separately. Back in April, he gave an address to the Lowy Institute where he outlined that he thought at least 1,500 more troops should be sent to Uruzgan province, and potentially up to 6,000, depending on how much the Dutch provide, or how much, the local forces and the US forces provided there once the Dutch left.
Tom, just on that issue of the Dutch, you know, they were providing air support for the Australian troops, and now it looks like the US is going to provide air support for Australian troops. Does that matter, or should the Australians be providing their own air support?
Well, 2 quick points. The first is force integration, which is how different military forces can work together. Australia works better with the US because of 2 primary factors, the first being the English language, and the second being that we do more joint exercises with the US and we buy a lot of the same military hardware. The second is that Australian air support in the form of helicopters is one of the requests. And there is a big difference between sending more troops and sending different supplies. And I think this debate is too often characterised as simply sending more troops, which misrepresents the entire dynamic on the ground. I mean, one of the recent Australian soldiers that died, arguably his life could have been saved if there was an Australian helicopter that was present and able to be sent.
Tory?
But,
Julia Gillard's about to go and have this meeting in NATO and discuss the possibility of increasing our commitment. How is she then going to come out and say, oh, well, actually, before when I said that it was fine...
That was just about right, yeah.
Is she actually going to be honest enough to tell us that it's about a lot more than they've been letting on? That's what I think will be quite interesting, because every man and his dog knows that there's more to it than they're saying. And that both of our major political parties are just kind of going, la, 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 let's pretend that it's still just this. And if she has to come out of this in the next few days and go, actually, they've asked us for more, it's going to be very interesting to watch how she justifies it.
I completely agree. Sorry, if I can just jump in. I think one of the most important meetings she'll have is when she actually meets with President Obama about this, after he has recently surged 30,000 troops in the region. But it also points to, I think, how Gillard is in many ways sort of politically excused the Labor Party from this debate by putting it almost largely on the shoulders of just the Chief of Defence Force and saying whatever the CDF wants, we will do. And the CDF has told me we don't need more troops, so we won't send more troops. In the US, General McChrystal, he came out and he argued for 40,000 more troops, which catalysed the debate over there.
It's an interesting political strategy, though, because, last week or the week before when that email came out from that soldier who was there and said, look, this is what happened and they let us down, I think that the public's reaction to the military's reaction was quite violent. I mean, the military stood there and said, this email is ill-informed. Now, it was from a bloke who happened to be there at the time, and it looked really bad, and I think people responded to it really badly. So if she's going to tie her political credibility to the military commanders, it could blow up in her face.
Tim, this issue's been quite divisive in the US too, and it's come out of Bob Woodward's latest book, Obama's Wars, that there's been real division within the Obama administration about how many troops should be there, how long they should be there.
Well, a lot of it centres on just how to fight guerrilla warfare, how to launch a counterinsurgency form of military engagement. The likes of McChrystal, the likes of Petraeus have been influential, obviously, in the US military in pushing this idea of a surge, the fact that you have to wage a form of total war against guerrillas. That's all fine and good in theory, but what it means in practice is that you have to commit a lot of troops over an extended period of time in order to subdue opposition and win. But I don't think it's just a military equation that we're talking about here. We're talking about a governance equation too. You can put in all the number of tanks or guns or soldiers you want, but unless you can govern effectively, you can't fight insurgents.
And it's such a complex issue when you've got someone like Hamid Karzai in power and there's so much corruption going on in Afghanistan, isn't there, Tom?
Absolutely. I mean, there's been articles coming about the president's drug habits or non-drug habits for quite some time, and they're interesting reading, just as Bob Woodward's book is. But, it's interesting. Your point is exactly right. Sending more hardware in itself is not the answer either. The last time someone sent tanks to Afghanistan was the Russians, and most of them didn't come back. So.
That's right. Well, while the US and the UK warn Europe of a potential imminent Mumbai-style terrorist attack, Pakistani author and commentator Tariq Ali says it's time to talk to the terrorists. Tariq Ali spoke at the Festival of Dangerous Ideas in Sydney on the weekend on the topic of what we can learn from terrorists. And he says, I don't believe that there's any group in the world which is waging a fight that can't be negotiated. So is it time to take the war on terror to the negotiating table? What do you think, Tim?
Well, in the case of Afghanistan, I do think it's time to think about a political solution, not just a military response to the problem. It's not as radical as it seems. Peter Leahy, the former Chief of Army, in fact, came out and said this a few months ago, that it was time to look to political negotiation to put the Afghan conflict to an end.
So to negotiate with the Taliban?
Effectively, yes.
But what's the starting point? I can't imagine that the Taliban are going to go, oh, well, what we actually want is, an international caliphate. But, we're happy to tweak around the edges of that.
Yeah, well, I guess the history of warfare and conflicts has shown that you can have a dialogue and have some kind of settlement with even the most supposedly extreme groups. Now, I'm not endorsing the Taliban's aims in any way, but I do think we have to look at the facts. The facts are we've been in Afghanistan for close to a decade. it's clear that we're not making the progress that we were meant to make.
But there are problems with negotiating with the Taliban, one of which is I think the Afghan government tried to set up a peace council to deal with this, and the Taliban said, number one, they won't negotiate while foreign troops are on their soil. So it sounds like even if they wanted to negotiate, they wouldn't be able to do that. What do you think, Tom?
Well, I mean, not an expert on the topic, but I think that his quote, reminds me of particularly when the national security strategy was released here earlier in the year, which was also sort of very traditionalist. It was very focused on hardline regulatory measures to fight terrorism, rather than dealing with sort of community-based models, which have worked very effectively in the United Kingdom, for example, where you kind of offset terrorism before it even begins as a thought process.
The other problem is, who do you actually negotiate with?
Yeah. And the Taliban's not as hierarchical as other terrorist organisations. So it makes it a very difficult situation. Also, Mitchell Reese, who's a former US Special Envoy, has written a book called Negotiating with Evil, When to Talk to Terrorists, and he said you need a few precursors before you can negotiate with terrorists. Number one, he said you need intelligence, good intelligence on that group, which the West does not have on the Taliban. He also said that you need a figure like a Jerry Adams kind of figure to be able to negotiate with, and also you need to be in a strong position. You need to either be in a position where you're winning, or the other group thinks that they can't win, and that doesn't. Those three precursors don't seem to be there in that basis for negotiating with the Taliban. Well, over the weekend, Australia reinforced its bids to host two major international sporting events. Prime Minister Julia Gillard met with FIFA boss Sepp Blatter in Zurich to lobby for Australia to stage the 2022 Football World Cup.
I stopped over to talk to the President of FIFA, Mr Sepp Blatter, about Australia's bid for the World Cup in 2022. I obviously urged him to see the merits of Australia's bid for the World Cup. We are, of course, a great sporting nation. This is the biggest sporting event in the world. Australia has a great track record of running major sporting events, including the Olympics in Sydney and the Commonwealth Games.
While Queensland Premier Anna Bligh is in New Delhi to promote the Gold Coast as the place to host the Commonwealth Games in 2018.
The job now is to win the hearts and minds of the 71 voting delegates. Today is our first opportunity